We talked about the need for new economic thinking to underpin better policies. We sometimes forget there's a relationship between theory and practice. And we talked about the old economic thinking, which has basically created this dichotomy of kind of state versus business, as opposed to how can they actually work well together on a modern, dynamic industrial strategy that's not about picking winners, but picking the willing. How can government work with those companies that are willing to innovate, to invest on the biggest challenges in Australia, whether it be around energy, health, the digital divide? That's what we talked about.
Did you get a sense that the Treasurer is indeed willing to use your ideas with his next budget? It's just 2 months away.
Right. Well, we talked about how my work on mission-oriented policies is influencing the government and how it really also requires government to work differently. So we need an interministerial, interdepartmental way of working. So for example, health and well-being is not just for the Department of Health. Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. So these missions and moonshots that can really galvanize interdepartmental thinking, but also working with many different industries around challenges, around the energy transformation. And yes, there is, for example, a national fund that is being set up, the 15 billion fund. But the question is, how can that actually create additionality? In other words, help businesses do what they wouldn't have done otherwise. And there's lots of interesting lessons around the world around that.
Australia, like many countries, is grappling with inflation, supply chain constraints and the energy transition. What is your view on how business and markets have positioned us for the structural shifts now underway and perform?
Well, I'm glad, first of all, that you say business and markets, because sometimes those are confused. The market is an outcome of how business is governed, how public institutions are governed, and how they work together. So the energy transition, it's really not just about energy. It's about changing how everything is done. What we eat, how we move, how we build, all the materials, cement and steel that are used currently are a big part of the problem with our carbon emissions. So the energy transformation has to also be about transforming manufacturing, and also in a country where manufacturing has fallen so much in terms of its percentage of GDP. It's also about really creating more dynamic ecosystem around digital services, the digital ecosystem, which really needs to go across all missions. But that doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't happen by just talking about growth or innovation and productivity, which, by the way, is very low in Australia. There's been falling productivity. And you have a productivity commission, but there's often been some old economic thinking there as well. This isn't just about, creating less frictions in the labor market. It's very much about actually getting business to invest, to innovate, to train workers, to invest in human and physical capital, which again, in Australia is below OECD average. We have low investment here.
Before privatisation, key assets such as roads and electricity were owned and operated by the government. Now they're underpinning our challenges with inflation. What is the role of government? How do you see it working in better partnership with business?
Well, inflation, as you say, is not happening right now, for example, from excess demand. So a rise in interest rates would maybe help dampen inflation when it's demand-side inflation. In fact, we have inflation globally being caused on the supply side, so excess profits, excess rents in the food industry and the energy industry. And, that to me is also one of the signs that we have socialized, if you want, risks, but privatized rewards. When we have these external shocks in the system, which then have increased gas prices, and certain types of companies in certain sectors have profited, not because they invested, not because they innovated, but they've, if you want, been lucky to actually benefit from what is a worldwide crisis and cost of living. And what we need in general is for businesses and public agencies to take risks together, but also to share their rewards. We can't continue to socialize risks and then privatize rewards. And that should be really at the center of how to build more symbiotic public-private partnerships. I'm a big believer in conditionalities. For example, when you have public funds, how can we make sure that there's conditions attached, that when a sector receives money from a public agency, it's conditional on that sector actually innovating and investing, paying workers better, using energy-efficient supply chains. This, by the way, is why we have green steel in Germany. The public fund there, the KfW, put as a condition to the loan program that the steel sector had to lower the material content of production. They didn't tell them how to do it. That would be micromanaging, but that was the direction. That's what was, if you want, the condition for receiving the loan. And we need a bit more of that. That's what then can catalyze investment and innovation and a certain direction for growth so that growth is more inclusive and sustainable.
What's your view on the US Inflation Reduction Act? Is it another example?
Well, it's interesting because Biden isn't getting the credit in the U.S. right now with the election for the success of that act in terms of what it's done for the United States. And many Trump voting states have actually benefited the most from those types of subsidies. But I think the issue is that we don't want just subsidies. I think I'm more of a fan of the CHIPS Act, for example, which created about close to 400 billion between grants and different types of subsidies for semiconductor companies, but it was conditional that they actually improve working conditions, use energy efficient supply chains, and reinvest profits back into production instead of giving them out just to the shareholders. So that idea that we can build back better, especially after the troubles during the pandemic, but also now with the worldwide energy crisis, it's not just about creating funds and subsidies and grants and guarantees. It really is about embedding some notion of the common good into these programs. And it's interesting how the Secretary of Commerce in the United States, Gina Raimondo, has really tried to do that with some of the programs.
Can you make suggestions as to how Australia could better tackle the energy transition?
Well, the first thing is to see it not just as energy transition, but really focus on climate, sustainability, and make sure that all the sectors, again, cement and steel that we use to build homes, there's a big housing crisis in Australia, new homes must be built, but we should have a sustainability criteria throughout that ambition as well. And so really using the climate and the energy transformation to do everything differently. I'm very inspired, for example, by what's happening in Sweden, where they even have this very broad challenge of a fossil-free welfare state, which then falls on the everyday things like school meals. School meals in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. That means they need to use outcomes-oriented procurement to crowd in innovative solutions around the whole supply chain of food, which then widens out the ecosystem of those suppliers, small and medium companies that are willing and able to provide innovative, if you want, food to schools. And so, really, I think an interesting challenge for progressive government, like the one you have in Australia, is to break down this dichotomy between the welfare state and the innovation state. How can we actually put public services like public transport, public housing, public education at the center of an industrial strategy and innovation policy? So all those things, including public transport, become innovative. And again, that requires investment in the sustainability across the entire value chain of those services.
If this isn't about picking winners, is it about creating local markets?
It's about picking the willing. Picking winners is about government in the old days of industrial strategy, just picking 3 or 4 sectors to prioritize. Often those sectors had captured government by being seen as more important than others. But there's many different sectors that might require support, but they shouldn't be receiving support just to exist, right? That idea of actually having missions that require new types of collaborations between many different sectors. I wrote about this in a book called Mission Economy, reflecting on what got us to the moon. There was a very clear mission to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time, but that required a huge amount of innovation in sectors as different as nutrition, materials, electronics, and all the homework problems along the way got us camera phones, foil blankets, software, baby formula. And that's how we should be thinking about our health and climate-related missions, all the homework problems that need to be solved along the way. And it's that which then causes growth, because those homework problems require investment and innovation. And so having an outcomes-oriented strategy that's focused on actually solving these really difficult challenges that require that cross-sectoral collaboration is the best way actually to achieve what Australia needs, which is more investment, more productivity, and a direction for growth.
Do your ideas mean that taxpayers need to accept more risk and could end up paying a greater price in the event of a failure?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's 2 ways to think about that. First of all, in terms of the focus that's often on the debt and the deficit, these are all investments which in the long run actually pay themselves back, because it causes, again, growth. It expands productive capacity, which is the denominator of debt to GDP. What you don't want is just helicopter money, which then doesn't expand productive capacity, which could, for example, then just cause inflation. But the second point is this issue of socializing risks and rewards that I talked about. I always give the example of Tesla. So both Tesla and Solyndra, two sustainable, if you want, companies, in the US both got close to 500 million in government subsidies. Solyndra went bust. The taxpayer had to pick up the bill. Tesla did well, and it was seen as, the genius Elon Musk. And what Obama did at the time, he was the president when Tesla received that loan, which was a guaranteed loan from the Department of Energy. Obama said, if you don't pay the loan back, we get 3 million shares in your company, which makes no sense. Why would you want 3 million shares in a company that isn't very good and so is not paying back the loan? Had he said, we get 3 million shares if you pay the loan back, the price per share between 2009 and 2013 went from 9 to 90. So that difference, multiplied by 3 million, would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. And that requires kind of a public venture capital mindset, where you're not just giving out money and then bailing out things when they go wrong and accepting that the private sector takes the profits when they go well. It requires being an investor first resort, having a portfolio, not just putting all your eggs in one basket, but being quite savvy in how to make sure the taxpayer is, again, getting back a benefit.
You've also talked about the dangers of outsourcing public capacity to the consulting sector. Can the big ideas, the big proposals that you are suggesting, which have the ear of the Treasurer, withstand the politics of the electoral cycle?
Right. Well, one of the key points that I've been making for years now is that in order to carry out mission-oriented policies, we need dynamic capabilities inside government, inside the civil service. And this consultification of government, which I've written about in my new book called The Big Con, Australia is actually a case study, right? All the different scandals that have come out recently with PwC and McKinsey. The problem is not just blaming those companies, it's asking why have governments in the past stopped insourcing, actually investing within the dynamic capabilities of the civil service. And I think that has to be a key priority for this government.
Mariana Mazzucato, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.